Hello, hello, listeners to the Third Way podcast. I use the word serendipity a lot, and well, because I believe in it. I love the things in life that can't be explained by what is already known. And one of those things is the way that connections happen, and that you meet amazing people, and some of them become friends, some of them become dear friends. And such is the case with my guest today, Dan Dowman. Dan and I met through a app matching tool called Podmatch, and I was on Dan's podcast I think last January or February, about a year ago, and but it feels like we've been friends 100 years. And I always think of the line from The Great Gatsby when it says, "My soul saw your soul and said, ah, there you are." And so Dan and I have had a similar type of connection, and I've been wanting to have him on my podcast and for a long time, and here we are. Hi, Dan.
Here we are. Thank you, Justin. It's great. It's great to be here. And it is funny how our paths crossed initially. I remember that first conversation that we had. It was just a real moment of like soul to soul connection.
Yeah.
I got off our call and I was like, I just met this really interesting guy. I said to my wife that you were like a monk, which is,
Yeah.
which I think which is fairly accurate if anybody
I'll
knows you.
take
You have
that.
some monk like qualities, that's for sure.
Thank
Um,
you. At
but
least
yeah,
you
and
didn't
it
say
does feel like
monkey.
we've known each other.
So
No, just definitely just the monk bit. Um,
yes.
but yeah, and it's interesting that I probably speak to you more times a month than my own parents. So I think that's a sign of how our friendship has grown and just
Yeah.
how much it means to
Right.
me.
Well, and you are along with, us, obviously some other people, Virginia, my buddy Juan, my sons, you're a muse to me. Like I have more ideation that comes out of our conversations. And so it's funny because this one, we have to put a framework to it because it's a podcast. We can't just meander doing ADHD jazz. It seems I heard someone refer to it the other day. Um, so there is a bit of a framework here, but I want to set it up with something that we have in common is that we both learned kind of in our own way how to leave systems that suppress the soul. And these were similar systems of around I control religion. Yours is more evangelical. Mine was more fundamentalist. But you, and we both have carried the gifts that we learned in those experiences, both in the being in them and then the leaving of them to our work today. And so give us like a 2 minute, like, how did Dan get here? A rundown. Because we're obviously going to get into what you know and what you do and everything, but how'd you get here in 2 minutes? Go.
In 2 minutes. Well, it's interesting to mention the kind of like the religious background because I look back with such fondness at my mum and dad, who were and are really fantastic community builders. And my dad was a Church of England minister. My mum was a school secretary. Um, and so our house was just like buzzing with people all the time, and we were very much a part of a much bigger community and part of a much bigger story. But what's quite interesting is that kind of adjacent to that kind of like local village church experience was kind of evangelical Christianity and the books that would come over from evangelical Christianity in the States with kind of some very, very strong and wild opinions about things, and kind of going to conferences and things where actually my parents, when they would attend events, they'd have really fantastic speakers, and the kind of the young people side of things often got a very kind of military style version of Jesus, right? And it
Yeah.
was kind of very,
Yeah.
very intense. And when I was growing up, I didn't have a way to distinguish between the kind of the village church stuff and the service stuff and the community building stuff and the other things I was experiencing. So for quite a while, I went off in that kind of quite fundamental direction. Um, and through that, though, I discovered youth work, and that's really where my career started, like building communities for myself. And over the years, as I kind of came across more and more kind of complex scenarios and realized that young people really were not a black and white audience, but there was all sorts of things that they were struggling with. Naturally, I kind of found my quite strict views on things tested and transformed and softened. And you know, you sort of, you find that before you meet somebody who is different to you, right, you perhaps aren't aware of your own kind of your biases about their situation. But I did find that as I met people on that journey, some of my views were challenged and transformed, and as I say, softened. And I kind of naturally came to the end of that chapter. This is longer than 2 minutes already, but I came to the end of that chapter, and I had a whole bunch of like marketing skills,
Yeah.
storytelling skills, facilitation skills, which I then took into the private sector. So that I was um, building high performing teams and working with startups, and ended up working with some interesting brands like HSBC Bank and Mint,
Hmm.
the chocolate company, familiar. That was a good fun project. I did get a lot of chocolate.
Yeah.
Um, and then I kind of continued with that sort of brand strategy and marketing storyline for a bit. But in parallel to all of this was a pattern of repeated redundancies, right? Every
Mm.
time I was really making it in my career, there'd be an acquisition or a pandemic, or when I was working for NGOs, like the funding would dry up. And I always found myself on the wrong side of that redundancy decision in the States, so you call it being laid off. And that happened to me 5 times in 11 years. And I kind of got to the end of that and I thought, well, the universe is obviously trying to tell me something,
Hmm.
that maybe I should be doing something different. And
Hmm.
that's when I decided to form Anthem, which is really bringing together those different worlds. So the kind of me as a community builder, that is
Hmm.
like the main driving force behind what I'm doing. But I also happen to have these skills in storytelling, marketing, branding. And so I'm sort of bringing those things together today to work with founders to help them tell their story, but also to help team leaders and teams make connections, to build community where they're at, to help their values come alive. So that's kind of where we are.
Cool. I mean, there's so many stories in there too. And again, it's we we have this in common too, that we escape the one system that suppresses the soul, which is high control religion. Not all religion it does that necessarily, but much of it does. And then also the system of what I refer to as corporate feudalism, which could be corporate
Mm,
feudal, like the feudal ages with the the feudal or futile corporate feutilism, which is just trying to teach a fish to climb a tree. And um, so you own a company called Anthem. We'll put the link in there. And I don't really want to talk about what Anthem is and what you do because, well, people are interested in you. You're the brand. They can go figure that out because it's pretty clear once you get in there.
mm,
What I want to talk about for the bulk of our time is what you believe in, your philosophy around something that I find to be refreshing, challenging, um, so many good things. And that is this bold statement you have right on the hero image of your homepage that I think you use the term thriving cultures are built on connection, not control.
mm.
And I know from just we're sort of encapsulating and all of our thousands of conversations it seems like we've had about this of there seems to be in this world of complexity and human interaction, and whether that's politics or business culture or society, kind of two camps, and I guess you could say three, where there's the controllers, the liberators, and then sort of the apathetic in there somewhere too. And so I guess my first question for you is, what do you mean by that statement? And then I want to break down what causes leaders to lean one way or the other between control and liberation. So what do you mean by a thriving culture is built on connection, not control? What does that mean?
So there's lots of different layers to it, and I will be exploring this throughout our conversation, really. Um, but control, it's really to do with that sense of people trying to control the narrative, trying to rule with hierarchy and with title and with pressure and with force. And things, and really it's about keeping the boot on people's neck, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so for founders, they might not have like an external boot on their neck, but when they're on LinkedIn, they're being told about tools and tactics the whole time. They're being told how to run their business the whole time. They're told if they don't post 3 times a week, then they're not going to get anywhere. And it's like, how do I navigate the algorithm? Right. So there is this kind of systemic boot that's on your neck over there. But if you're in working for a business, then you've got KPIs and other pressures and all these kind of things. And so that's the sense of control that I'm talking about. But when people are leaning into their natural human instincts around empathy, kindness, generosity, reciprocity, that's when things really start to happen for people and teams. Because really, the control thing is to do with fear, right? Like it's a very fear centered way of doing business. And when you kind of apply pressure and the boot and the fear to people, yeah, they're going to work hard for you for a few days,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they're not going to work hard for you for 6 months. They'll leave in 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
like because people don't leave their jobs; they leave their bosses,
Right.
right? That's as the saying goes. And and so when you're not intentionally leaning into these ideas of community and connection, relationships,
Mm-hmm.
trust, yes, it's countercultural to lots of businesses because those kind of things do move a little more slowly at first, right?
Mm-hmm.
As people find their feet, find their cadence with one another. But actually, fast forward 6 months, they don't leave you. Fast forward 6 months, they are the most creative, most interesting, most innovative, most badass team that you can imagine, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
think about the small businesses that kind of are in our universe, like it's the people who've got something to say, who are really
Yeah.
connected to themselves and their sense of mission that I'm tuning into.
Yeah.
The rest of it is kind of like it's just noise. So
Yeah.
that's really kind of connection versus control for me and how it's showing up for people.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, is a challenging thing. And this is what I love about this philosophy that you have behind everything you do is that if you're many people, I think, get into leadership positions in order because of their impulse to control. And
Mm,
um, but the natural state, like real leadership, is liberation. It's freeing people, and it's um, it's a sense that um, if well, I'll put it this way: if we reverse the philosophical statement into a negative, it would be you cannot build a thriving culture on control. And I think there's an
mm,
illusion that, and this goes back to Virginia talks a lot about this of what I refer to as smokestack thinking, which is industrial age thinking, where humans for several hundred years, which still continues to today, they adapt to the system in order to keep their job, so they can participate in the system, economically. And so there's this thinking that people are just sort of part of the machinery. And you can see this with the slash and burn that's happening in our federal government now, and the way that people are being treated, and like the tone of like the separation emails. They're like, they'll get an email and they're so dehumanizing. Um,
mm,
and it's there's this thing of like basically treating people like parts of the machine. So if you have that
mm,
view, if you have the view that people are parts of the machine and not parts of a system, then you think it's just about pushing buttons and pulling levers. And the easiest one to pull, especially for men, is the control lever. I mean, it's essentially what the patriarchy is. It's a system of control. And so, and then you're immersed in, all of the um, business theory out there around what my friend Massimo refers to as the obsession with up and to the right, or another way of saying shareholder value in a more creative way. And it points to me that, we have more MBAs than ever in the history of the world, and we still have the same problems. It really hasn't
Mm,
solved anything because it's reinforcing a lot of the narratives about that people are parts of a machine. They're not the system, they're parts of a machine. And so this idea, it also reminds me of someone, a friend and a client, Alan Preston, who his philosophy statement with his brand, what he does as an executive coach, is he calls it reciprocating authority. And that the philosophical statement is that power is meant to be given away, is that leaders get into a position of power so they can distribute power, which is another form of autonomy. But if you think people are part of the machines and they can't be trusted and they must be controlled, and you see this with like the push from Jamie Dimon at Chase or Amazon or whomever to like get people back into the office. Well, there's no factual reason to do that. It's an impulse to control. There's no data
mm.
to support that that's a good idea. So anyway, we could the whole podcast just be about that. But I want to get your take on what do you think causes leaders in their own journey to lean one way or the other, to lean into either control or to liberation? What are some traits that you see
Mm.
that are kind of the factors that push them one way or the other?
I don't know about traits necessarily, but I do think it's interesting that if you and I, and we could ask, we could bring in someone on the podcast who is perhaps emblematic of, the sort of control model in leadership. And we would have a great conversation, wouldn't we, about like what are the human movements that we most admire? Or what are the great protest movements in history that we look back and say that was a really important moment? Or what are some of the greatest brands, the most memorable brands that people love?
Mm-hmm.
And all three of us would, fringe politics aside, or kind of conspiracy theories aside, right? Like there are definitely, I think, people in this who could be on this call who would come up with some other things that we weren't expecting. But typically, you'd all call out the same kind of things. Like I think back to, free education here in the UK and, broadly around the world. It was because children used to work in the mills,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they worked 6 days a week and they had one day off and they weren't educated because they were poor. And it was wealthy children who received an education and didn't work. So the church got together here in the UK and said, well, why don't we like start running Sunday schools and we can start teaching kids on Sundays because they've got the day off and we think everyone
Mm-hmm.
should receive an education. It wasn't about Bible study. Like it's become about Bible study when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
Sunday school, but it was
Yeah.
originally it was about education, like actual education. And now we sort of take those things for granted. And we would all line up and say, we should all have education. We should have education for everybody. I mean, it's not the case in the States, but in the UK, we think we should have free healthcare for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we live in a system and in a broader system that is constantly steering us towards fear and uncertainty because we need to be positioned in the right way to make political choices or to buy the right products. And so what we end up doing is saying, well, we should have free education and healthcare, but those people who came across in the boats, though, I'm not really sure. Like, it's great that somebody took me out of the mill. Yeah, my great great grandfather didn't have to work any mill anymore, and he got the free healthcare and free education. But this person who's come across in a boat or jumped a fence, or I'm not sure they should get that, because if they get them, that's then there's less for me. Like
Mm-hmm.
somehow we live in this incredible era of opportunity, amazing sort of civil liberties that have been afforded to us.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're so fearful about having our own freedoms compromised by the other. We're still othering all these other people. And
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting to me that there is this kind of like political movement, political bias, kind of like economic bias against the very things that we get to enjoy and that were once won for us. So I think that's a really interesting kind of
Mm-hmm.
broader thing. Um, in terms of why I think people sort of lean one way or the other, I think you're a product of the story that you're brought up in, right? Like there's that Yiddish proverb. I think Malcolm Gladwell sort of like thrust it back into the
Yeah,
mainstream when he
right,
said, to the worm in horseradish, the world is horseradish.
right.
And so for me, I mentioned my story of my mum and dad and, village church life.
Hmm.
I'd grown up in a context where I wasn't the center of the universe, right? My home life was very much like we were a part of a bigger community. And the kind of spiritual story that was kind of directing my life at that age was that, God loves you
Right,
and God wants what's best for you and everything's going to be all right. And, it's kind of like going to church on Sunday, like for 30 years
right,
was kind of like enforced. Wasn't when I was 30, I wasn't being forced to go. So
right,
it wasn't that kind of control. But it was kind of like, you know, spending an hour a week for my entire life practicing mindfulness,
right,
like thinking about the mysteries of the universe.
right.
And, but lots of people didn't spend 30 years doing that.
Mm,
They've grown up in much more competitive, much more kind of frustrated environments, much more fearful environments.
mm,
And so when you enter the workforce, if command and control, if the boot on your neck are the only
hmm.
things you've experienced, then you're looking for the next person to step on. Not because you're a bad person, not because you want to do that, not because, but the idea that you could choose to be something different has probably never occurred to you because to the worm and horseradish, the world is horseradish.
Right.
So I think that's the thing.
Yeah. So that's super interesting. I would just offer kind of a different framework is that I think it comes down to your level of consciousness and
Mm,
around how much inner work you've done. And inner work could be contemplative work, or it could be trauma integration or a combination. It doesn't really matter because when you do it, your consciousness goes up. And this is what the whole concept of like namaste is, the divine in me sees the divine in you. And if you're a leader that doesn't done the work to raise your consciousness, and you are given power, or you earn, air quotes, power, you will use it to control people. So then it splits into
mhm,
this: you're either going to be an asshole or you're going to be paternalistic. And so it may not be a boot on the neck. It may just be the constant, steady pressure of a hand on the back telling you what to do.
mm,
And I think that I've yet to see a person that has done the work of consciousness and maintained their impulse to control. I haven't seen that. It could be, but I have not seen that, especially in a business environment. Um, it seems to flip the concept of hierarchy to what Ken Blanchard referred to as servant leadership. That I am not in control of these people. I am responsible for these people, but I'm in service to them. So
mm,
the impulse is to nurturing, the impulse is to understanding, the impulse is into listening, and it doesn't mean that it's passive. It is still an active form of leadership. Um, but and there will always be hierarchy. We're mammals, and mammals have hierarchy, and it's just a matter of how we use it. Same with wealth. There always will be wealth. It's just a matter of how we use it. It's all energy. And I also think that this is why you see people that come from, at least in the US, from traditionally marginalized groups, when they get into leadership positions, lead in a very different way, especially people of color,
mm,
immigrants, and people from the LGBTQ community. They just lead differently. And I think it's because they know what it's like to be marginalized and to come into a system of oppression. And so there's this sense of like, it's not even noblesse oblige, it's not like that. Like, I made it, so now I'm going to help you. It's not even that. It's just a deeper sense of compassion more than anything.
mm,
Um, so you have these virtues, or I don't remember exactly how you would call them, but they're sort of the kind of these guiding principles within what Anthem does. And with the, as much time as we have, I want to explore them. And there's three. And the first one is, tell me if I got this right, wholeness over rightness. So
Mm,
what does that mean?
yeah.
What does that mean here, especially in context to the greater philosophical idea that essentially what you're saying, not to put words in your mouth, but is that a leader's main job is to build connection, not to control things. That's they're to facilitate connections and nurture culture. And when you do that, everything you want
Mm,
related to up and to the right and growth and innovation, that will happen. Is that fair?
mm.
Is that a fair way to summarize it?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I think the kind of the sort of the other way in is that thinking of leadership as a creative act. So in the kind of control sense of leadership, it becomes this static, defined roadmap thing that you do. Like it's got a few set plays about this is how you do leadership,
Mm.
right? And whereas actually, if you want to be a leader who is liberating, who is kind, adaptable, somebody who is wanting to see the whole person succeed, you need to approach leadership more as a creative act. And as I mentioned before, I've seen the best and the worst of company culture. I mean, I've experienced these 5 redundancies. Not all of them, but they were all pain. Some had some pain, but some of them were very painful.
Hmm.
And it's because of the way decision makers handled those situations. In record time, we could go from we've been acquired. This is amazing. You're going to get promoted. We couldn't have got hit. We couldn't have come this far without you. To a week later, being shown the door and being put on gardening leave. Do you know what I mean? It's like there is at one point you're trying to talk to me from this kind of like creative, like liberating tone,
Yeah.
but it wasn't true
Yeah.
actually because you were running the numbers behind the scenes and getting ready to smash lives.
Hmm.
And so you have to think of leadership as a creative act. And the people who are able to embrace that are, of course, those who've experienced firsthand, what that can look like. I mean, I'm kind of probably a slight segue, but there's this lovely story that I know of these three World War II troops in France during World War II. And I'm not sure how kind of it's one of those stories that you hear, and I don't know how true it is. And
Sure.
yeah, feel free to somebody can get in touch and tell me the true story if they want. Um, but these three guys, there's these three Allied troops, and their friend was killed, and they carried his body to the local church. Like I said, this is in France, and they knocked on the door of the church, and they said, "Oh, our friend's been killed. Can we bury him in the churchyard?" And there's a priest, Catholic priest. He said, "Well, was he Catholic?" And they said, "Oh no, he wasn't. He wasn't Catholic." And the priest said, "Well, I'm sorry, you can only be buried here if you're Catholic." And so they're devastated, right? And they carry his body just to be on the wall of the churchyard, as close as they could get, and they bury their friend in the dirt just outside the churchyard, just on the other side of the wall. And do you know this story,
No,
by the way? Okay, well, this is
I love that. I
this
love
works.
learning new stories
Um,
like this.
so years later, they fly out back out to France, and there's a memorial, a World War II memorial, and there's like I said, they're both still alive, and they say, "Oh, it would be great if we went and paid our respects to our friend." And so they jumped in the cars and they were driven up to this old church, and they wanted to go and see their friend. And they went to the spot where they thought they'd buried their friend. They'd left a little stone marker, and they couldn't find it anywhere. And they wandered around the church, and they thought, well, maybe we just made a mistake, and they couldn't find uh, where their friend was resting. So they went up to the church and they knocked on the door, and a younger priest, came to meet them, and they said, "Oh, we came to see our friend. We buried him here towards the end of the Second World War." And the priest's eyes lit up, and he said, "I've heard of you, and they're a bit confused for a moment. He said, "My predecessor, he used to tell this story about how these troops came to bury their friend, and he turned you away, and he said that he'd felt devastated by his decision, and so you can't find your friend because that night." The priest, stone by stone, he went outside and he moved the wall to include your friend.
Wow.
And then he guided the, makes me want to cry thinking about it, to be
Yeah,
fair.
right.
And then he it's not even else, it's true story.
Mhm.
But then he guided them to where their friend was resting. And the reason why I tell that story is that every single person who chooses that path of consciousness and chooses a different way of conducting leadership has to come into contact with somebody who shows them that the wall can be moved. They
Mm.
need that face to face, that heart to heart, soul to soul moment where you go, oh, things can be different. I can move the wall. And if actually you're someone who's listening to this conversation between Justin and I, and you're thinking all this kind of wholeness, like cosmic mumbo jumbo, whatever, I want to speak to you and say, look, but you can move the wall. There is a different way of doing things. And we're going to talk in a minute about
Mhm.
kind of being decisive, right? Because I think some people go, well, I don't want that because it's going to move so slowly and we've got to make decisions. It's a tough world out there. We need tough people. Yeah. Do you know what? You're right about a lot of that stuff. But you can also move the wall. There
Mhm.
are different ways that we can approach this. And that brings us to that first point about wholeness over rightness.
Mhm.
When we lead with rightness, we don't move the wall. When we lead with rightness, that wall stays fixed.
By
When we lead with
rightness, do you mean like
wholeness,
correctness? Like, do you like doing things the correct way? What do you mean by rightness in this case? Are you
I
talking
think
about
rightness can mean,
like perfectionism, or like what I sometimes refer to as process worship? Is that what you mean, or what do you mean?
yeah, I think it's about things being black and white.
Mm.
I've made a decision and the system is fixed.
Mhm.
I'm the leader. My
Mhm.
decision
Mhm.
goes,
Okay.
I'm right.
Right.
Right. Things remaining fixed in that way. And the thing is, sometimes you are right. Like it's not rightness
Yeah.
itself isn't an evil,
Yeah.
right? But we say wholeness over rightness because sometimes you are right and sometimes you need to make a decision. But
Right.
when you put wholeness first, you're expanding your horizon, you're
Mhm.
expanding your context and perhaps seeing more of the puzzle. And this is really, really important because actually it helps you to be vulnerable. It creates space for kindness and adaptability. But crucially, for leaders who need to learn to move the wall, it actually starts to reveal when to break the status quo.
Mhm.
Like, and you can't see that if you're not thinking with a wholeness mindset and you're just thinking about hierarchy, structure, power. You're not going to notice when it's time to move the wall. And that's what the kind of wholeness kind of expands your horizons in that sense.
Mhm.
And just to stay here a little bit longer, there's sort of Anthem's vision of leadership is really kind of growing in some interesting directions. And now we like to talk about wholeness, obviously, as one part of that. Rightness is part of that as well. So you've got, because you do need to make decisions, be
Mhm.
decisive, move the needle. They're all really important things. But also howness. So we talk about rightness, howness, and wholeness,
Mhm.
and how you need to have all of those things in balance in leadership because rightness without howness and wholeness
Mhm.
becomes tyrannical, right?
Mhm.
Autocracy,
Mhm.
utilitarian. But howness, which is about lots of like HR folks, very howness
Yeah.
driven people, is a very noble pursuit. But without rightness,
Mhm.
decisiveness, or without wholeness, thinking about the whole person, it just becomes bureaucracy,
Mhm.
red tape. People say, well, my situation isn't the same as this policy, but I still need support. Actually, if you follow the policy, you go, well, if we said, that's why people like to say, and this is something I hate in life, people say, well, if I said yes to you, I'd have to say yes to everybody. It's like,
Gross.
no,
Yes.
you wouldn't.
Yeah.
No, you wouldn't. You can judge things on a case by case basis and make allowances.
Mhm.
Policy, that's where it takes you. Now, I'm not saying let's get rid of all policy, but you've got to have howness with rightness and wholeness. You've got to have the
Right.
balance. Otherwise, you become a bureaucrat.
So,
And then the last one there is. So I just did
yeah, yeah,
the last part of that,
yeah, please.
and and then wholeness without rightness and howness is just paralysis. And we were talking before this conversation. I know so many well-minded, conscious to a degree people who never get anything done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why so many people really struggle with wokeness or leftist or like, these kind of protest movements is because, yeah, I mean, quite often not getting stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
And what you need to do is temper that sense of wholeness, because that you can over-index on that and not do
Right.
stuff. Rightness and howness, you need to have all three working together.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I like the multidimensionality of it, and I think um, it makes sense to me, and it also goes to this idea that a mentor of mine, Rose Fast, said she didn't like the word manager. She was trying to get rid of the word manager, and she's done amazing work. You should look her. People should look her up. FASS, Rose Fast. She's got some great books out there too. But she would say, leaders, you lead people and you manage numbers, and most of the shit that companies are dealing with is because they have those backwards. And
Mm.
and I think that's so profound in this, and it matches what you're saying. And something I often say is you need to see soul before role too. It's a whole human.
Mm.
This illusion. This is why this illusion of like social issues and politics and what's going on in the world is somehow separate from business is horseshit. It's not. Um, and it's the marketplace that, so therefore it is business. It's a comforting illusion, mostly for people in power, to say that it isn't. It is separate. I also like the idea that if you put wholeness over rightness, you will want to, as a leader, help a person meet their goals, not motivate them to meet your goals. And I remember
Mm.
when I ran a sales team of around 30 people back in the early 2000s. I don't know where I didn't learn this. I just intuitively knew that I needed to understand their motivation. Like, what was their motivation behind what they wanted to do? And I found out and the youngest person on the sales team was like 23, and the oldest was like 74, and very different points in between. And I found out, I sat with every one of them and find out what do they really want, what's their motivation. And I said, well, I'll make a deal with you. You help me get what I want, I'll help you get what you want. And then the performance question changed. It's like, well, you didn't hit your numbers. It means you didn't get me what I needed. That's to make me look good as the head of sales. But you also didn't get you what you wanted. And so what's up? Like, what
Mm.
caused that? And I think it's pretty rare in business to see the wholeness of people, because I'll put it through in brand language too, is being right is not branding. If it were, then we wouldn't be in the situation we're in a lot of different ways. Being right, being correct, being factual. If being right worked, they would put the ingredient panel on the front of the box, but they don't. And so
Mm.
wholeness is understanding the decisions are made of the emotional part of the brain. It also means perfectionism as a brand is boring. Sameness is boring. So show a little bit of what I refer to as emotional nudity. Like,
Mm.
be a little bit raw in the fact that you don't have it all figured out as a brand, especially if you're an individual, but it's, even also as if you're a little bit, if your brand's a company, a larger company, is
Mm.
the wholeness is the messiness too. And your brand is a documentary. It's not a blockbuster movie,
Mm.
ultimately. Anyway, All right. So the second principle, and we're going to have to rock through
Well, I was
these.
just
Yeah.
gonna, yeah, we will. But I was going to add just very quickly to that point. And I know that there are going to be business leaders who are listening to this who are making really tough decisions, and because the numbers are working against you. Like, and Justin and I are sitting on this kind of podcast high tower, kind of like casting judgment. I like
That is
we
okay.
get it,
Yeah.
and there are still wholeness conversations that are vulnerable and honest and real that you can have with people to say, this is where we are. I'm going to tell you the truth. And there may be some difficult decisions to come down the track, but you can still approach those kind of conversations through a lens of wholeness. Like, it's
Hmm.
not about kind of saying, "Hey, it's easy, just treat me with wholeness," and then
Yeah.
your money
It's,
worries go
yeah, right.
away. We
Yeah.
we get it.
Yeah.
We get it.
That's
But
why I'd
think
like to
about
reiterate.
what
You
would it
need
look
all,
like to have wholeness driven
right.
conversations.
And you need all three of what you said,
Yeah.
because, that's the system. There's an operation inside of that. So, okay.
Yeah.
Reciprocity over extraction. That doesn't sound, mystical at all. What does that mean?
It's it's really simply, that any team or any business, whoever you are in kind of whatever operation you're leading, what you need to do is build a sense of community and connection around what you're doing. So if you're a founder, this is about you finding advocates. It's about you finding that sense of tribe, people who trust you, know you, who are going to champion you. Sometimes they're going to buy from you. Um, Most of the time, not. But focus on the relationships, and some of that will come too. Whereas if you're in a team setting, it's about shared interest. It's about advocacy. It's about building trust. It's about having that sense of interconnectedness with the people around you. And we've been talking about command and control structures, systems, people being treated like machines. You know, in those environments, it's all about, I need to put the pressure on you to hit the KPI,
Hmm.
right? That famous story about Wells Fargo,
Yeah.
who started creating fake customers so they could hit their
Yeah.
KPIs. Like,
Right.
that's where you end up, right? And so this is really about saying, actually, you need to develop that sense of community and connection around whatever you're doing. So there is that sense of it being an ecosystem of shared interest where
Hmm.
advocacy can begin to flourish, where trust can begin to flourish, and about that movement going from me to we. Um, and it's not easy, right? Like it's nothing that's going to just happen overnight, but it's about your group who you're working with, really developing that sense of shared practice, becoming a community of practice, if you will. Um, and again, when that happens, lots of leaders are scared of this stuff because it means moving slowly at first, but you accelerate, you retain the best people, you then attract the best people, and you're off. Like, this kind of stuff creates velocity of all kinds
Hmm.
down the line, including financial velocity. Your numbers will look fantastic, but you've got to be brave enough to start moving away from some of the traditional checks and balances, ways and measures that are holding you
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. I That sense, and I guess what I'm hearing in that too is, it's the old, Dale, Stephen Covey in the Seven Habits. That was pretty timeless in what the wisdom that he came up with in those things.
Mm,
Back in the late '80s or whatever it was, and it was that win-win or walk away. And I also love the Go Giver from Bob Berg, and the Go Giver business fable, which I highly recommend. And this is, whether it's employees or customers, doesn't really matter here, is if you lean towards control, your first impulse is going to be, what can you do for me, even if you're being nice about it.
mhm,
If you're leaning towards liberation,
mm,
it's, what can I do for you? And it doesn't mean being like taken advantage of, because there's, the interesting thing is leaning into reciprocity is also honoring boundaries. As the saying is in boundaries with relationships, boundaries are there to protect the relationship, not prevent it. That's what boundaries are for.
mm,
And in this case, you would lean into reciprocity by saying, what can I do for you? with a limit in the sense of if they're not reciprocating, you can just move on. It's okay. You don't have to be friends with everybody. And
Mhm.
and it's that impulse. And I like that you use the word extraction here because it's almost like I'm gonna take from you what's yours, and I'm going to give you a pittance of it in return. And then when I get what I'm done with you, I will discard you. That's why
Mm.
people hate, justifiably so, what I call corporate feudalism. That's very common, sadly. And it doesn't need to be that way. You don't have to do that. And it kind of goes back to like layoffs in particular. It's like it's a weird thing that I could be fact checked on this, but it's very rare that there's layoffs in Japanese business culture. What happens is the CEO or the person in charge resigns because they are the ones that failed. You rarely see that in
Mm.
American business layoffs, which is it's similar. It's certainly, these are all kind of interwoven pieces here. Um, and again, back to consciousness. If you have higher consciousness and you see the soul of another person and you see your own soul, then why would you want to exploit them? That would be strange. That would be like they don't go
Mm.
together, and it's not about
Mm.
changing. I'll put it this way. None of these are about changing behavior. It's about changing your mindset, and then the behavior changes too. These aren't remedial. What you're saying here.
Mm.
They're mindsets.
And it's interesting what you said about the boundaries, and about, because I think because people can be afraid that if they are, are entering into that kind of reciprocity mindset, that actually they may end up being the victims of extraction, right? And so I think it's absolutely right that you mentioned boundaries. And again, you think about that rightness, houndness, and wholeness. It's not about you kind of going headlong and never thinking about what decisions do I need to make, or what's the process, the howness, like how do we make sure this relationship functionally works well for both of us? Yeah,
Hmm.
that's all in there as well.
Hmm.
But it's about, yeah, it's why it's an important virtue for Anthem,
Hmm.
though, is kind of like just that, how are we going to connect?
Yeah.
How are we going to share? How are we going to make sure this works for everybody and not just the people at the top?
Well, let's do. I had an aha moment, but I'm going to wait till we do the third one here. So the third and last virtue that you have, and what your philosophy is sovereignty over commodity. I think I understand what that means. So what's the 2-minute explanation of that?
It's about respecting the agency of people around you, but respecting people's autonomy. So making sure that you're not viewing people as viewing people as resources to exploit, customers as like potential customers as targets to manipulate, but actually you're going completely the other way and acknowledging people's autonomy, respecting their agency, respecting their time, because it's very counter. Like everybody who's talking about branding on the internet, it's all about tell an emotional story, play on their fears. People try to come up with the cleverest way that
Yeah.
they can scare people
Yeah.
somehow into parting with their money. And do you know what? They do it because it works. Like people part with their money because they're
Yeah.
scared,
Right.
or don't want to miss out,
Yeah.
or people come along to events at work or take opportunities because they're scared and they don't want to miss out.
Right.
And I get it. I get that it works. But no one gets to the end of their career and goes, "I'm really proud of the work I did there." If by doing work like that,
Yeah.
if you can think of people, think about sovereignty instead of commodity, actually that kind of manipulative outlook is going to rot away. Genuine connections are going to emerge. Shared ownership is going to form, and that stuff is the cornerstone of trust and advocacy. Like if you can
Hmm.
get that right as a brand, again, you know, you may move a little slower at first, but the kind of brand you'll build, the kind of team you will build,
Yeah.
people are going to talk about you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If you're a team leader listening to this and you're doing this kind of work in your offices, people are going to talk about what's that team doing?
Yeah.
Like
because they're going
Why
to
are
be
they doing
kicking
better than
ass, right?
us?
Exactly.
Right?
And I think it's almost like this. There's a huge difference between I want a piece of you and you're a part of this. You know,
Yeah.
it's like
That's a really great way of putting it.
it's a
Yeah.
huge difference in that mindset. And these are all kind of interwoven around this the idea of connection versus control. Um, and I think that part of sovereignty too, from my lens as a brand perspective, is you as a brand are not a commodity. Do not commoditize yourself, because if you do,
Mm,
you cannot compete with being the same as everyone else, except not having the ad budget of the sameness machines. You have to be
mm,
different, but really different at the very beginning. And also, you can tell customers or clients or prospects to fuck off if they don't value your worth. That's okay. In fact, it's encouraged. One of my this business has since been sold, but there was a business in Phoenix that was a carpet cleaning business. In order to do business with them, small business, in order to do business with them, you had to get a letter of reference from one of their customers. I mean, that's radical. That's sovereignty over commodity. Um, and I've always admired when, like in a big company, when like a supervisor would confront someone that is mistreating one of the employees, like a customer that's mistreating one of the employees. I saw a video of I think of Burger King, where these two old white ladies were saying racist things to one of the staff members, and the manager came out and kicked them out of the store, and they actually ended up getting banned for life from any of the Burger Kings. That's sovereignty
mm,
over commodity too. Is you don't have to take shit from people just because you're a business, and you need you don't have to do that. Um, in order to be sovereign as a brand, you got to know who you are. And I've seen this over and over again, that so many people, especially small solo entrepreneurs, which is a lot of the work I do, they don't know who they are. And so they go do marketing, and marketing cannot solve an identity crisis. In fact, in many ways, it will make it
mm,
worse. And if you know who you are and you put yourself out into the world of who you truly are, not a hologram that you felt like you had to create because that's what everybody else said to do, you'll never become a commodity.
mm.
Um, and there's power in that too.
You know, just as you were, I've been playing with an idea, and did not plan on talking about this on this podcast because no, it's still not ready yet. But
All
you
right.
talking about kind of like knowing who you are. Like, I'm aware that there are people who who will be listening to this who will have an emotional response to that story about move the wall, or like think about how you can move
Mm-hmm.
the wall, and you're thinking it resonates with me kind of at a deep level somehow, but I don't know how to articulate it. I don't know how to, and that can be very frustrating. I mean, you feel something, but nobody's yet shown you how or talked you through how you can do something with it, with that
Mm-hmm.
emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure people will be having different emotional responses. I've been talking. Simon Sinek loves to talk about start with why, and I get it, right? Get a clear why, and everything's going
Yeah.
to be all right.
Right. Right.
And there's some great wisdom in there. I, however, have been starting to think about this idea of start with who. There are
Mm-hmm.
so many people who are feeling stuck, who don't know how to move the wall, who don't know how to get, like, they've got a great story in them, but they're not sure how to tell it yet. Or you were telling me before about, before this call, like, when I work with people, what are the questions I'll ask them before I meet with them, right? So I can get to know them a little bit better first. There are going to be loads of people who are having that kind of emotional response, and think, but I just don't know how to take this thing forward. This emotion that
Mm-hmm.
I've got, I don't know how to take it
Mm-hmm.
forward. I don't know how to move the wall. Start with who. Justin and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit for a second.
Mm-hmm.
We would love to hear from you, to hear like what you responded to,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps we can unpack with you where you might be feeling a bit stuck.
Yeah.
And maybe, though, it's not right to get in touch with us. Maybe there are people around you that you can just talk to and say, look, I was listening to this thing and I had this reaction. What do you think it means?
Hmm.
Because actually, by having that dialogue, maybe some other storylines will start to emerge. But you've got to start with who. The why,
Yeah.
that's going to come up
Yeah.
through those conversations.
And it's the internal who. Who am I? Now, who's my audience?
Mm, yeah,
Because that's very common. Like, well, who's your target audience? Well, yes, at some point you need to figure out who you're trying to reach, but it's even then, it's like flipping the polarity of it. Your audience isn't who you're looking for; it's who's looking for you. Well, they're not looking for
yeah,
you, the hologram that looks like everybody else. That's why I jokingly say it's like white dudes and business casual are the new bots. They kind of all sound the same, and so it's like, where's that originality, that rawness? And
yeah.
um, it may take way too long for like somebody that's sort of a middle manager, for lack of a better term, to kind of create a culture where it is wholeness over rightness and reciprocity and sovereignty and all these things, and they're being themselves, the team is thriving, yada yada. It may take a long time to do that, which is where I want to close with this beautiful thing that you've created called Culture Crush. And I have been a guest a couple of times as a speaker. I've been a participant. It's refreshingly simple. It is a word that is extremely rare. It's fellowship. It's like a group of people
Hmm.
that we all kind of get the same thing. We have very different paths, very different personalities. So give a little pitch to Culture Crush about what it is and why someone should be a part of it, which is free, by the way. This isn't a pitch to sell something. It's a community
Yeah.
that you've created. So let's wrap with that, with an invitation to be part of Culture Crush.
Well, I think it actually goes back to the thing that I just said. When I said that start with who, I totally agree with you, by the way, that kind of like that internal who. Yeah. But also, I mean it very, very literally. Like, who are the people you need to talk to help you figure this stuff out?
Mm-hmm.
And Culture Crush really is an exemplar of that idea. Now, I originally started it because I work alone a lot, and I'm very mission driven, and I didn't want to work by myself the whole time. And again, from my roots, I used to remember on a Friday morning once a month, my dad would host a prayer breakfast. I won't bother trying to explain what that is, but the
Yeah.
idea, the concept of a group of guys getting together, eating breakfast and praying. What a rush! Anyway, but I sort of like that idea of, you mentioned it, fellowship.
Yeah.
Getting people together who were like souled, who were wanting to do some good in the world, but actually often, because of that drive, felt a little bit lonely. And I thought, right, I can't be the only one who feels like this. I'm going to start a thing. And Culture Crush was born. It's a podcast, newsletter, and a meetup. And it's going to change, actually. What we're going to start doing is, it used to be podcast first, and then we'd do a meetup. Going forward, though, the best conversations happen in the meetups. So going forward, it's actually going to be having a meetup first, exploring the theme, hearing the great discussion that it generates, and then taking that forward into a podcast episode. Not every time, but sometimes. And really, if you're a founder and you want to change some stuff for the better and you're working alone, or if you're a team leader and you're part of a system that is putting pressure on you and you just have that sense of discomfort a lot of the time, Culture Crush is where it's at. You're going
Mm-hmm.
to meet like soul people. Reflect is like, always has a short reflection and some open conversation and the chance to grow your network. And that's all it is. It is
Yeah.
so low key. Like, to call it an event might be overselling it,
Yeah.
but it's working for people. Over 1,000 people have joined in recent months,
Yeah.
and people people really enjoy those meets. So visit anthem.io, sign up to the next one, because it would be awesome to see you there.
That would be awesome. Yeah. And again, this is one of those things where Culture Crush is a reminder that in a world that feels like sometimes it's this is a bit reductionist, but full of either the assholes or the apathetic. There's another group of people that they're not dead inside, and the world is a really weird
Mm,
place right now, especially the business world. And I love that you've
yeah.
created this home, and I love that looping full circle, that you didn't want people to feel like you did when you were young, so you created a new community. You know, you know it's sort of an antidote to loneliness or isolation, and you've done that, and we've seen that with the richness of the
And
conversations, and the people that find their way to Culture Crush are such beautiful humans. And
yeah,
so kudos to you for that. So I'll put all of this in. I'll put your website in the show notes. I'll put Culture Crush in there. I might put other things, but anyway, this was awesome. Thank you for this chat. It felt very much like we do, like just turn the microphone on and do what we do.
see what
And
happens. Yeah.
yeah, and also we're going to do another one of these. It's not going to be a podcast per se. It's going to more of like a video like we're going to record a discussion around um, kind of it's almost like almost like a webinar around what it means to build authority. And we're going to combine our skills,
Mm,
your skills and my skills, to help people that are thought leaders become authorities, not just, content generators. So stay tuned for that. All right, my brother. Thanks for the chat.
thanks, Justin. It's been great. Speak to you soon.